named Jack. And Jack was out for a walk, out for a tramp. And as he was walking along, he came to a very steep cliff and he slipped and he fell. And as he went down the cliff, he grabbed hold of a tree and was hanging onto this tree with all his strength just by a branch. And he looked down and there was hundreds of feet straight down to the bottom. So he started to shout out, "Help, help, somebody help me, help me." And he yelled out for an hour or so. Nobody came to his rescue. He kept shouting, "Help, help." Finally he heard a voice. He said, "Jack, I'm here." "Oh, good, help me, get out of here." He says, "Just wait a minute, Jack." Jack says, "Who are you? Where are you?" And the voice says, "I'm the Lord." Jack says, "You're God?" "God, I'll go to church every week. I'll stop sinning. I'll pray every day. I'll do everything. Just get me out of here." And the Lord says, just don't rush, Jack. Just easy what your promises are. And he says, "Jack, just listen to me. Just do this one thing. Just let go." And he says, "Just let go, Jack." There was a big silence. Next minute, Jack, "Help, help, is there anyone else out there?" We're talking about faith in God. A few weeks ago, Phil talked about God and God's faithfulness. Then I think Lindsay followed up with about Caleb. You remember about Caleb and the faith of Caleb. And then last week, Andrew spoke about George Mueller and the faith that George Mueller had as he fed hundreds of orphans over there in Bristol. Today we're looking at another man that I believe is a great example of faith, and his name is David. David was he's been called the best king that Israel has ever had. He was only the second king after Saul, but he's been known as the best king. And I enjoyed what Laura said this morning about God's heart. David was called a man after God's own heart, which just tied in as Laura was sharing with that. So I'm going to tell you a story which is probably quite familiar to a lot of people, but it doesn't matter, we're still going to go through it. We're going back to about 1100 BC, so we're going back a long, long time. And David was about 15, 16 years old. He was only a young fella, a young boy really, and he had 7 older brothers. I don't know that he had any sisters. But he was an important part in the Bible because there's something like 66 chapters of the Bible is devoted to talking about David. And you won't find too many other people in the Bible that have that much devoted to them. And even in the New Testament, his name is mentioned something like 59 times. So David was an important character in the Bible, and there's certainly some lessons that we can learn from David. He was a shepherd boy. Worked for his dad on the sheep farm. And I know a little bit about sheep farming. I did it for a while, and I can picture David, the stuff that he used to do. And when I thought about talking about David, I was going to impersonate him like I did with Elijah in my last talk. But decided against that. But I can still picture David out there looking after the sheep. Sheep get flies, and he'd have to clean up the flies, and he'd have to get the clippers out and crutch the dags off the back. And when it come to lambing time, he'd be walking around his flock of sheep maybe once, maybe twice a day, checking that they're having their lambs okay and they don't need assistance or whatever the problem was. So I can really identify with David and what he was doing. And he would be out there every day, all day, looking after these sheep. And his other brothers, some of them were soldiers, and they'd be away at fighting wars and all that sort of thing. But Dave was out there one day in the hills, and I bet he loved it out there. I mean, sheep farmers generally love what they do, and that's why they do it. And they're out there just enjoying the fresh air and the countryside. And Dave was out there one day, and he saw some guys coming across the hill towards him, and he recognised them as his brother, or maybe might have been more than one of his brothers. And they came over to him and they says, "David, you got to come back to the house." He says, "What for?" He says, "Oh, there's a man there wants to see you." And there's a man at Samuel's house, at David's house, his father's house. His father's name was Jesse, and his name was Samuel. And Samuel's a prophet of God, and God had sent Samuel to Jesse's house where David lived, to anoint somebody as a king. Because God had told Samuel that one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king of Israel. So Samuel there with his horn, I was going to bring a horn and I didn't. A sheep's horn, it was probably a sheep's or a cow's horn, it was full of oil. And that was the tradition of the day, that they'd find the right person who's going to be the king and they'd pour oil over his head, and you're anointed to be the next king. And when Samuel got to the house, he said to Jesse, he says, yeah, where are your sons? And the first guy came in and his name was Eliab, and he was a big, tall, strong, good-looking guy. I was going to say like myself, but no. And Samuel straight away thought, this is the man, because in those days, size was a huge part of being a king. Saul was the king, and he was the tallest man in the land, and he was head and shoulders above anyone else. So that means he was about that tall. Saul was huge. And that's one of the big things of being a king, was being big. So Samuel thought, this is him, Eliab, he's the guy, and he almost got his oil out to pour, and the Lord said, and he said, no, that's not the one. So he started to go through all the other brothers, and the other brothers were nice, big, handsome, strong guys as well. And every time, as he thought, this is the one, God said, no, Samuel, that's not him. And he got right to the end of them. And he said to Jesse, he says, have you got any more sons? And Jesse said, well, just the young fella that's out in the paddock out there looking after the sheep. He says, go and get him. So that's why when the brother had brought David into the house, and David was said to be handsome, he was said to be good looking, he was probably only of average height, maybe 6 foot or something like that, but still a very good looking boy. And Samuel immediately, as soon as he saw David, he says, this is the one. This is the one who God has chosen to be the next king of Israel. And he got the oil poured on his head. And he was chosen as the king. Have we got a picture up there? Oh, yeah, we've got a picture up there. And there's a verse, which I can come down here and I can read the verse. 1 Samuel 16, and this is where the story of David really starts. There's a verse there that has incredible importance. Samuel was looking to find the right king, and he was looking at the outward appearance. But God was telling Samuel, no, Samuel, he's good looking, he's tall, and he's strong, and he's handsome, but I'm looking at the heart of the person. And God had looked at the heart of David, and he knew that the heart of David was right. That's a great verse. And that was one of my big verses in my, I was going to say arguments, my discussions I used to have with my father. When I was a teenager in the 60s and 70s, it was cool to have long hair. And we had many discussions, Dad and me, about the length of my hair. I did have some back then. But this is my verse. Dad, the Lord looks on the heart, not on the outward appearance. And that was my big strong point. We still had very serious discussions. But the question comes, how's your heart? Right now, God can see your heart. He knows what you're thinking. He knows what's in your heart. He knows what your priorities are. And I was thinking last night when I was lying in bed, those verses in Matthew, I think it might be Matthew 6, it says, store up treasure in heaven. Don't store treasure on earth where moth and rust can corrupt or thieves can break in and steal. Store your treasure in heaven, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And that's important, isn't it? What we value in life is what's in our heart. And as God looks down today and looks at our heart, I wonder what he's looking at. I wonder what he's seeing. So anyway, David had the oil on his hair. I guess he washed it off pretty quick. It wouldn't feel very nice. And he was back to the farm, back to the sheep. And he was out there for probably several years. He was only 15, 16 when he anointed as king. He didn't become a king actually till he was about 30. So 14 years later, as I say, the oil would have certainly washed off by then. So he was back to the sheep, and Israel's a little bit different to sheep farming in New Zealand. They had more predators than we have. We have the odd wild dog that might come and take a sheep, but that's about it. But out there, David was there one day, and he looked across the paddock at his sheep, and there was a bear. A huge big bear with one of David's sheep in its mouth. that would be a bit scary, and a lot of shepherds would have straight away gone to protect the rest of the flock and let the bear run away with that one. They'd want to look after the rest, but David didn't do that. He did something a bit different. He chased the bear and he caught him. And this is where I believe that David had incredible faith, because not many men, women, child, shepherds or whoever would go chasing a bear. It's usually the other way around. But David, I really believe the Lord had a huge amount to do with this. A man wouldn't be able to just outrun a bear, catch the bear, open his mouth, get the sheep out, because this is what the Bible tells us happened, take the sheep out of his mouth and then kill the bear. That's not just David. He was just an average-sized guy. That was the Lord and David's faith that managed to do that. A little bit later, I don't know how long, a bit later, there was a lion came along. Now, lions run a lot faster than bears, but the same thing happened. David had the strength from God, the faith that he had in his heart to chase the lion, catch the lion, open his mouth, get the sheep out, kill the lion, and let the sheep go back to the rest of the flock. He had incredible faith to start chasing after a lion. I guess the lion wasn't worried about chasing David because he already had a roast dinner in his mouth, so he wouldn't need to chase David. So David was a man of faith. But there's another side to David which I also identify with. You can see some pictures up here. You might recognise some of those pictures, Matt. It's on Matt's farm up in Marpara Road up that way. There's black sheep up there. I don't know if they look like Israeli sheep. But David was a man of music. And this is probably another way that I really identify with David. It's not David there, by the way. David loved his music, and he would have sat out there under a tree when he's watching his sheep, and he had I don't know what you'd call it, but it's like a guitar. Apparently, I read about it. He would have had a piece of wood, and he got the small intestine of a sheep, dried it out, and stretched it across the wood like strings, and it was just like a guitar. And he played that with incredible skill. And he would sit out there, and he'd play his music. He would write song after song, and you know some of the songs, the Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. You know them, create in me a clean heart, oh God. All those psalms that David wrote when he was sitting out there in the fields. And he wrote beautiful songs. Well, he was out there again one day, and his father sent for him. And he said, look, I want you to come into town, into the house, and then go to town, because King Saul had got depressed. It says in the Bible that the Spirit of the Lord left King Saul. Nowadays, when we become a Christian, we receive the Spirit of God, and it stays with us, doesn't depart. But in those days, the Spirit could come and go. And at one stage, the Spirit of the Lord was upon Saul, and another time the Spirit of the Lord left Saul. When David was anointed king, it says in there that the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. At this stage, the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and Saul was miserable, he was depressed, he was actually going a little bit crazy. And one of his aides said to him, he said, look, Saul, I think you need a bit of soothing. I think you need a bit of, just to sort of chill out a little bit. He says, I know a guy who could probably help you. His name's David, and he's very skillful at music and singing, and I reckon if he just came into your house, into your palace, did a bit of music, I think he'd really help with your situation. So David had to pack up his guitar and head off to town. They lived in Bethlehem, which is not too far from Jerusalem. Bethlehem probably sounds familiar because that's where Jesus was born. And he took off down into town, and he started to play some music and sing to Saul. And it did wonders. It really soothed Saul and really encouraged him. So what's the verse we got up there? The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear. Well, we've come up a little bit early on that verse, but that's all right. That's probably my fault. David had a reputation. When that aide of Saul said to Saul, look, I know this man, he says, and David was only 16, but he says, this man David is skillful, he's a warrior, he's wise, he's handsome, and is godly. What a reputation to have when you're 16 years old. So So David, he used to go back and forward from Bethlehem to Jerusalem and playing to Saul and soothing him. And then a few years later, Jesse said to David, I want you to go down to visit your brothers. They're down in Jerusalem, out down that way, fighting a battle against the Philistines. I wanted to take them a bit of food, a bit of cheese, and a bit of, chocolates or something, just to encourage them. So away David went, had his parcel, and away he went down to see his brothers. And he found his brothers, and he gave them the goodies that his dad had sent down. But then he heard this sound. He could hear this fella yelling and roaring. And as he looked down, it was in a valley. There was a sort of a hill on both sides, and there's a valley in the middle, and the valley was only about 100 yards or 100 metres across, and the hill on each side. So over this side we had the Israelite army, on this side we had the Philistine army, and down in the middle was this fella Goliath, who you've heard about. Goliath was probably close to 3 metres high, and at least probably 200 kilos heavy. He was huge. You've got to go, over a metre taller than me. He was a massive guy. And he was down there defying the armies of God, the armies of Israel. He was actually just totally defying them. And I'll just read a verse in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, verse 8, and it says, Goliath stood and he shouted to the ranks of the Israelites, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then he said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing those words, the Philistines the Saul and the Israelites were dismayed, and they were terrified. And David heard all this, and David was a man of God. He was a man of God's own heart. And he thought, I can't stand to hear somebody defying the armies of God. That's the God who I serve. That's the God who I pray to, I honour. And he couldn't stand to hear it. And he said first to his brothers, and his brothers didn't want to listen. He said, "Look, I want to go down and fight this guy Goliath." And they said, "Look, go home. Go back to your stupid sheep out in the paddock there. There's no place for a young boy like you here." But somebody else heard him say it, and they got the word to Saul. And he went to Saul. Saul sent for him, and David went to Saul, and he said, "Saul, look, we can't have a man defying the armies of God. We're going to sort this out. We've got to fix him." And probably deep down, Saul thought, this is great. Because Saul was the king. He was the biggest guy in the country, and he should have been the one fighting Saul. Not the rest of them. It should have been Saul, because he was known as the biggest, tallest, strongest man, and he should have been the one fighting Saul. So he was probably quite happy to have David come along and do this. And Saul says to him, "How do you think you're going to handle that?" And this is what he said to Saul: "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." Talk about faith. 16-year-old boy and a 3-metre high giant who had another guy with him to hold his shield. So there's really two of them. It gives in the Bible the weight of his spear. It's huge. David was confident in his faith. He says, "God will deliver me." See, when David had been out in those fields for years and years, he had learnt a lot. He had learnt to see clearly in a situation. Because when you're out in the farm, you've got a lot of time to think. And when I had the farm, we had a big hill up the top. Actually had a huge big cross up there. But I'd often go up on that hill and I could see 360 degrees around. And sometimes I would just sit there. Alison thought I was out working, but I was just sitting up on the hill. And you just enjoy the scenery and you talk to God. And it just opened your mind to think clearly. Because you just took time out to do it. And David also learned to act confidently. So when there's a bear or a lion comes in, attack your sheep, you've got to know what you're doing. You've got to be confident in where you're at and what you're doing and what you stand for. But he also learned to walk humbly. David wasn't a big man full of himself. He was a humble man, humble boy, if you like, humble person. And there's some verses there that David wrote. They coming up in the next verse up. David wrote a lot of the Psalms. And some of these verses were talked about last week when Andrew talked. For you have been my hope, sovereign Lord. Can we go to the next one, please? This is the one I think that Andrew talked about last week quite a bit. Psalm 119. I rise before dawn and I cry for help. I have put my hope in your word. In you, my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are God, my Saviour, and my hope, that word hope keeps coming up, is in you all day long. And there's the last one. How can a young person stay on the right path? By living according to your word. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. I've hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. These are all verses that David wrote, and they're thoughts that he obviously really held true. So eventually Saul says, okay, David, you can go down and you can fight this fella. He says, here's my armour. And you can imagine Saul was head and shoulders above David. You can imagine what the armour must have felt like or looked like. I bet he couldn't walk 2 meters in it. But he says, I don't want that. And he also knew in his heart he didn't need that. He thought he must have known that the Lord didn't need him to have a big steel armour on to beat this fella. So then he took 3-4 things out. He took his stick. And a lot of farmers will carry a stick, a stock stick they call it. He took a stick, he had a pouch, and I've got one at home, a leather pouch which shepherds carry because they always have, things in it, knives, and sometimes they'll have all sorts of first aid stuff to help sheep. He took his pouch and he filled that with 5 stones and he had his sling. And I read about that sling, and I'd love to see one. I haven't seen one, but I've read what they look like. And apparently it took a lot of skill to be able to use a sling, let alone be able to get a stone to go in the right place. So he took a sling. And if we see the next slide, I think it's Goliath up there. And David said to the Philistine, well, first the Philistine, what he said to David was quite incredible. Is that 17 verse 45? Goliath was full of himself. He was full of how good he was. He wasn't thinking about anyone else. And in verse 42, he looked over David and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said, David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Can you imagine as David walked down that hill, down to the valley, the noise must have been horrific. All the Israelites were probably just about packing their bags, ready to run. Because they saw this little tiny fellow walking down there and thought, what hope has this guy got? So they'd be probably screaming and shouting, Saul, what are you doing sending this fellow down there? And on the other side, all the Philistines, they were laughing their heads off. The noise must have been amazing because hundreds of Philistines there laughing like crazy as they saw this little shepherd boy walk down with his little sling in his hand and a stick. And Goliath out there 3 meters tall with his armor bearer and his full armor on. The noise must have been unbelievable. But anyway, David walked down there, and David's comments, is that the verse up there we've got? I haven't got it all written down. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. I come against you in the name of the Lord God Almighty, the God who you defile. That must have been some of the bravest words that David ever spoke. Can you imagine walking down there, looking at the size of this fella, and he spoke those words? Man, what a man of faith, to be able to stand in front of a Goliath and quote those unbelievable words. Because if God didn't come through for David, he was dead. Simple as that. He didn't have a chance if God didn't come through and help him. He had that shout of confidence when things get down. I wonder if we do that. When the chips are down and things are going not our way, do we have that shout of confidence that, yeah, God's going to come through for me? Sometimes we struggle with that. We've been through a whole lot in the world lately, haven't we, with COVIDs and protests and goodness knows what's going on in the world at the moment, monuments getting ripped apart and all sorts of things. Do we have that confidence in God to say, yeah, God, you are my hope, you're the one I trust, you will deliver for me. And right here was the whole plan of redemption was at stake. Because you've got to remember that David was in the line of Jesus. 1,000 years down the track, 1,100 years down the track, Jesus was going to be born. If David had been killed, that line, that tree was broken. So the whole big thing, the whole salvation of the world here was at stake and rested on that verse that David quoted, because Jesus was going to be its descendant. Well, we know the story. You know, you whipped the sling around, the rock came and hit the guy right in the forehead, the only place where there's no armour. He fell to the ground dead. As tradition in those days, you went and cut the head off the guy. He used his own sword Goliath's sword to do that. We don't need to go into the gory details. But David became popular. Everyone loved David. I mean, why wouldn't you? He was the hero. He had saved his whole nation. He was so popular, and Saul became so jealous, partly because the Spirit of God had left him, but Saul became totally jealous of David. And that's another story we're not going to talk about today. But Saul became afraid of David because the Lord was with him. That's what it says in chapter 18, verse 12. Saul became afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but the Lord had left Saul. And yeah, we know that all sorts of things happened. Saul was doing his best to try and get rid of David after that. And often if you live for God in today's society, you start to create some enemies. Because what you believe is different to what the other people believe, and they don't like the morality that you sort of live by. And you can create enemies and people that don't want too much to do with you if you stand up and say you're a Christian. But in verse 14, and several times in the chapter, it says, but David behaved wisely. And that's so important, that David behaved wisely. And as Christians today, if we're a Christian, we have to behave wisely and be seen by our society to have standards that we live for. So that day, David and the Lord were the Saviour of Israel. But 1,100 years later, Jesus was the Saviour of the world. Amen, exactly. You know, it says in the book of Romans that all have sinned, all have done wrong in their life and fall short of God's standard. And it says also in Romans, for the wages of sin is death, but God's gift, Jesus Christ, is the way of salvation. In John chapter 14, verse 6, you probably know the verse, it says, Jesus is speaking, and he says, I am the way, the truth, the life. You can't get to God unless you come through Jesus. If we go back to that little story when I first started, Jack hanging on the tree. He's hanging onto the tree, and when God says, just let go, trust me. He says, help, anyone else up there? I tell you, there's no one else up there. Jesus is the only way that we can get to heaven. That's the only way that we can get to God. And we've got to have trust in God to deliver us from the evil one. There's two places we can go when we die. One's heaven and one's hell. And Jesus is the only way that we're going to get to heaven to be with God. So I just leave that as a challenge to you. David's life was unbelievable. A man of incredible faith. If I get to talk about David again, we'll go through some of the terrible stuff that he did. He fell into sin in a big way. But at this point of his life, David was a man after God's own heart, and he was a man of faith. And we can learn from him, not only to grow our faith, but to trust Jesus and knowing that he is the way of salvation.